When did a stranger publicly reveal all of your secrets? I was doodling in my notebook when our new substitute teacher walked in and immediately called me out. Elizabeth Payne, still drawing instead of taking notes, I see. Just like you do in your diary every night at exactly 10:47 p.m. The entire class went silent. My pen froze mid-stroke. How could she possibly know about my journaling routine? I'd never told anyone about that specific time or that I drew in my diary. And Arthur? She turned to my best friend. How's your grandmother doing? Still hiding her illness from the family? Sorry for the spoiler. Arthur went pale. Mrs. Owens smiled pleasantly as if she hadn't just dropped 2 bombs. She was young, maybe late 20s, with auburn hair and an outfit that screamed, trying too hard to be the cool teacher. But her eyes were sharp, calculating, watching our reactions. Let's start with attendance, shall we? She didn't use the roster. Instead, she walked down each row naming students and adding personal details that made everyone squirm. She knew that Alvia's parents were secretly separated, that Harold had failed his driver's test 3 times, that Zoe still slept with her childhood stuffed elephant. How do you know all this? Alvia finally asked, voice shaking. A good teacher does her research. Now let's discuss Romeo and Juliet. But nobody could focus on Shakespeare. We were all terrified of what else she might reveal. During her lecture, she kept dropping hints. She mentioned Eli's shoplifting incident that had been expunged from his record, referenced Sarah's birth parents. At lunch, 15 of us gathered in the back parking lot. Everyone had the same shocked expression. How did a substitute teacher who'd never been to our school know our deepest secrets? Maybe she's a stalker, Eli suggested. Or a private investigator, Zoe added. But none of those explanations covered how she knew things we'd never told anyone. Arthur pulled out his laptop and started searching for information about Miss Owens. Nothing came up. It's like she doesn't exist online. We decided to investigate. Alvia's mom worked in the main office, so Alvia volunteered to check Owens's personnel file during her free period. Harold would follow her after school to see where she went. I'd search for any connection between her and our families. Alvia returned from the office looking disturbed. Her file is basically empty. Just her teaching certificate and references from schools that don't exist. But here's the weird part. Her emergency contact is listed as Dr. Owens at our local psychiatric hospital. That name hit me like a brick. The same hospital where my aunt had been treated for paranoid delusions 5 years ago. She'd always claimed someone was watching our family. We thought she was sick. My brother was at that hospital, Harold said quietly. 2 years ago. He was hallucinating. One by one, everyone revealed connections. Family members who'd been patients, friends who'd been treated there. All of us had some link to that hospital. After school, Harold texted that he'd lost Miss Owens in traffic. But I'd found something else. My aunt's old journals from before her hospitalization. She'd written about a young woman who appeared at family gatherings and community events. The description matched Miss R. Owens. That evening, I called Arthur and told him about the journals. We decided to confront Miss Owens the next day. When we arrived at school, she was already in the classroom, writing names on the board. Our names, with dates next to them going back years. Good morning, she said without turning around. I assume you figured out some of it by now. You've been stalking us, Arthur accused. She finally faced us. Studying, not stalking. There's a difference. Why? I demanded. Because you're special. All of you. Connected by trauma, and by the thin threads that bind communities together. I've been documenting how teenage social dynamics form around shared hidden pain. For 5 years, Alvia had arrived and was reading from a paper. This is from your real personnel file. You've been planning to substitute for our class since we were in middle school. Miss Owens' smile widened. Longer, actually, since some of you were in elementary. I needed the perfect group. 15 students, all with connections to the psych hospital. You were my dissertation subjects. That's illegal, Harold said. Studying minors without consent. Your parents consented. They just didn't know it. The psych hospital's admission forms include clauses about long-term family studies. I helped write them. We stood frozen as the weight of it hit us. Our family's most vulnerable moments had been legal permission for this woman to study us like lab rats. My research is almost complete, she continued. Just 1 more week of direct observation. Then I'll disappear and you'll never see me again. Though of course I'll continue monitoring from a distance. We'll tell everyone, I threatened. The school board, the news, everyone. She laughed. Tell them what? That a substitute teacher knows things about you? I've done no illegal recordings, no break-ins, just observation and psychological analysis. Plus, would you really want your secrets made public in a legal battle? The bell rang and other students started filing in. Miss Owens returned to her sunny substitute teacher persona. We had no choice but to take our seats. As class began, she turned to us with that horrible smile. Now, who wants to share what they did last summer? Elizabeth, why don't you start? Tell everyone about what you did on July 25th. Everyone turned to stare at me, and my face went pale like I was about to pass out. I thought I'd somehow gotten away with it that day. My fingers dig into the desk edge until the wood grain cuts into my skin. Every face in the classroom stares at me, and I can feel my chest getting tight like someone's squeezing it. I force air into my lungs and make myself look at Mrs. Owens instead of the floor. My voice comes out shaky, but I manage to say I don't feel comfortable discussing my personal life in class. Mrs. Owens tilts her head to one side like she's really interested in what I just said. She smiles and tells me that's perfectly fine, then turns back to the board and starts writing about Romeo and Juliet's secrets. But I can still feel everyone's eyes on me, and my face is burning hot. A folded piece of paper lands on my desk, and I open it under my notebook. Arthur's handwriting says library after class and nothing else. I look over at him and nod once, grateful he's not asking me what July 25th means. Mrs. Owens keeps talking about how the characters hide things from each other and how secrets shape relationships. Every word feels like it's aimed at me, even though she's looking at the whole class. My hands won't stop shaking, so I sit on them and try to focus on breathing slowly. The clock on the wall moves so slowly I think it might be broken. When the bell finally rings, I grab my stuff and practically run out of the classroom. I don't look back to see if Mr. Owens is watching me leave. The library is at the other end of the building, and I walk fast past groups of students hanging out by their lockers. Arthur, Alvia, Harold, Zoe, Eli, and Sarah are already in the back corner near the reference section when I get there. We huddle together between two tall shelves where nobody can see us from the main area. I tell them Miss Owens almost made me confess something really personal in front of everyone, and my voice cracks a little. Harold says this has gone way beyond creepy, and Zoe agrees it's actually dangerous now. Arthur pulls out his phone and shows us an email he already sent to Vice Principal Howard requesting an urgent meeting. Harold suggests we all write down exactly what Miss Owens said to each of us with dates and times so we have proof. Alvia looks worried and tells us her mom mentioned the school is really careful about substitute teachers because of legal issues. She says we need to be smart about how we approach this, or the adults won't take us seriously. We agree to meet in the library during lunch period to write everything down. The warning bell rings and we split up to go to our next classes. I can barely focus during second period because I keep thinking about what Ms. Owens knows and how she knows it. At lunch, we spread out at a big table in the library and everyone starts writing. I watch as the lists get longer and longer on everyone's papers. When we compare what we've written, I feel sick to my stomach. She's revealed something deeply personal about each of the 15 students in our class. Eli points out she's been in our classroom for less than a week, but somehow knows secrets that some of us have never told anyone. Sarah's list includes stuff about her birth parents that even her adoptive parents don't know she knows. Harold wrote down how Ms. Owens mentioned his driver's test failures in front of everyone like it was no big deal. The bell rings again and we have to go to our afternoon classes. I spend the rest of the school day in a fog, barely hearing what my teachers say. When I finally get home, I go straight to my room and pull out the box of my aunt's old journals from the back of my closet. I've been avoiding reading them since we found out about the hospital connection, but now I need to know. The first two journals are mostly about daily life stuff, and her symptoms getting worse. On the third journal, I find an entry from 5 years ago that makes my hands start shaking again. My aunt wrote about a young woman with reddish-brown hair who showed up at my grandmother's funeral. The description says she stood off to the side taking notes on how everyone interacted with each other. My aunt thought it was weird, but everyone told her she was being paranoid. I read the entry 3 more times and my stomach drops because the woman my aunt described is definitely Miss Owens. The next morning, I get to the school early and see Eli standing by his locker looking pale. Miss Owens is next to him talking in a low voice that I can't hear from down the hall. Eli shakes his head and walks away from her, but she follows him. I watch them go around the corner toward the science wing. 5 minutes later, Eli comes back and he's shaking so hard he can barely open his locker. I walk over and ask if he's okay. He tells me Miss Owens cornered him and suggested they have an informal counseling session about his past mistakes and how he's grown. He said he wasn't interested and tried to walk away, but she followed him for 3 hallways, asking increasingly personal questions about his shoplifting incident and his family situation. During our free period, Arthur, Alvia, and I go to the counseling office. The secretary tells us Amira Whitaker can see us right away. We sit in her small office with motivational posters on the walls, and she listens carefully while we explain what's been happening. Amira doesn't interrupt or tell us we're overreacting. She explains we can file formal complaints through the district harassment process. She gives us printed information about our rights as students. She tells us she's required to report certain things to administration, but she'll work with us to make sure we feel safe throughout the process. After school, I go home and spread out all my aunt's journals on my bed. I find 4 more references to a woman who showed up at family events and community gatherings over a 2-year period. The descriptions match Miss Owens perfectly down to the way she would stand at the edges of groups and seem to be memorizing conversations. One entry describes her at a neighborhood barbecue writing in a small notebook. Another mentions her at the grocery store watching our family shop. I realize she's been watching my family since I was in middle school, and nobody believed my aunt when she said someone was following us. At 9 o'clock that night, my phone buzzes with a text in our group chat. Arthur says he's been researching recording consent laws and school policies for the past 3 hours. He explains that while we could try to secretly record Miss Owens, it might not be legal, and could hurt our case if we want to file official complaints. He suggests instead we keep detailed written logs with exact quotes, times, and witnesses. It feels less satisfying than having actual recordings, but he's probably right that it's smarter in the long run. I text back agreeing with his plan, and one by one everyone else in the group does too. That night, Harold sends a link to a secure cloud document with password protection that only the 15 of us can access. I open it on my laptop and see he's already set up columns for date, time, location, what was said, who witnessed it, and a notes section. I start typing in my first entry about the July 25th comment from today, including the exact timestamp from my phone and listing everyone who was in the classroom. My hands shake a little as I type out her exact words, because seeing them written down makes it feel more real and more threatening at the same time. Over the next few hours, I watch the document fill up as everyone adds their incidents, and by 10 o'clock we have 12 entries ranging from her first day to this afternoon. Arthur adds the thing about his grandmother with timestamps from 3 different classes. Alvia documents when Ms. Owens mentioned her parents' separation during attendance on day 1. Harold enters the time she followed Eli through 3 hallways asking personal questions. By 11:30 we have 15 incidents, and I'm adding 2 more from today that I hadn't written down yet. At midnight I refresh the page one more time and count 17 total documented incidents, each one showing Ms. Owens targeting specific students with information she shouldn't have. The pattern is impossible to deny when you see it all laid out like this. Dates and times proving she's been systematically revealing our secrets since the moment she walked into our classroom. The next day in class, Mrs. Owens is teaching a lesson on Juliet's secrets and how they drive the tragedy forward when she stops mid-sentence and looks directly at me. She says something about how interesting it is that Juliet thought her secret activities in late July would stay hidden, then adds that we all do things in late July when we think no one is watching. My vision starts to tunnel and everything gets blurry around the edges. My hands go completely numb and I can't feel the pen I'm holding. I force myself to breathe slowly through my nose, counting to 4 on the inhale and 4 on the exhale like Amira taught us. I write down exactly what Miss Owens said with the timestamp from my phone, my handwriting shaky but readable. I refuse to look up at her or give her the satisfaction of seeing me panic. Around me, I can hear other students shifting in their seats and whispering, but I keep my eyes on my notebook and keep breathing steadily until the numbness in my hands fades. After school, I'm driving home on the main road when I pass the psychiatric hospital and see Miss Owens' silver car in the parking lot. It shouldn't surprise me given that her emergency contact works there, but actually seeing her car makes my stomach twist. I pull into the coffee shop across the street and park facing the hospital entrance. I watch as she walks up to the building carrying a leather bag and goes inside through the staff entrance on the left side, using a key card like she works there. I sit in my car for 40 minutes checking my phone and pretending to drink coffee while keeping my eyes on that entrance. When she finally comes out, she's talking on her phone and looks relaxed, not rushed or worried at all. That evening, I call the hospital's main compliance line, and a recorded voice gives me options for different departments. I press 3 for compliance and wait through 2 minutes of hold music. A man answers and says his name is Reed Stiles and asks how he can help. I tell him I have questions about research consent forms that patients sign during admission. His voice gets colder and more professional, and he explains that any concerns about consent forms need to be submitted in writing to the compliance office. I ask if he can at least tell me about the general protocols for research involving patients' families, and he says he can't discuss specific protocols or researchers without a formal written complaint. In our group chat, I share what Reed said, and everyone responds with angry emojis. Alvia suggests we all ask our parents to dig out the old admission forms from when our family members were patients at that hospital. Over the next 2 days, 8 families managed to find their paperwork in basements and filing cabinets. Arthur's parents have his grandmother's forms in a box labeled medical records. Harold's family finds his brother's intake packet in their home office. My mom locates my aunt's paperwork in the attic. We scan the forms and share them in a private folder, and when we start reading through the dense legal language, we find clauses buried on page 7 about long-term family studies and observational research on community dynamics. The language is vague and confusing with phrases like participants' consent to ongoing assessment of family systems and community integration patterns. None of our parents remember reading these sections or understanding what they were agreeing to. Arthur comes to the school on Thursday looking exhausted with dark circles under his eyes. He tells us his grandmother's illness is now common knowledge in his extended family because someone's cousin saw Miss Owens' class and word spread through family group chats. His parents spent last night on the phone with relatives who are hurt and upset because they think Arthur's immediate family deliberately kept them in the dark about the grandmother being sick. Arthur says his mom was crying because her own sister accused her of not trusting the family with important information. He's caught between being angry at Miss Owens for forcing this to become public and feeling guilty about the family drama even though none of this is his fault. During my study hall period, I go to the main office and tell the secretary I need copies of my aunt's intake and consent forms from 5 years ago. She looks surprised but pulls up the records on her computer and prints out a packet that's been partially redacted with black marker covering certain sections. Even with the redactions, I can see my aunt's signature on a form titled Community Mental Health Research Participation Agreement at the bottom of page 9. I'm certain she didn't understand what she was signing because she was in crisis when she was admitted, and probably just signed wherever they pointed. The form uses words like longitudinal observation and family system mapping that sound scientific, but don't actually explain what they're going to do with the information. Harold tells us during lunch that his older brother finally opened up about his hospitalization 2 years ago. His brother remembered a research assistant being present during his intake interview taking notes on a tablet. At the time, he thought it was normal hospital procedure and didn't ask questions because he was scared and confused about being admitted. Now he feels violated all over again, knowing his teenage mental health crisis was treated as research data for someone's study. Harold says his brother keeps asking why the hospital didn't explain things clearly or give him a real choice about participating. Alvia arrives at the school on Friday morning looking upset and won't make eye contact with anyone. During first period, she passes me a note saying her mom pulled her aside before school and warned her not to access any more personnel files. Alvia writes that HR is apparently sensitive about the substitute situation and her mom could get in trouble if Alvia keeps digging through restricted records. At lunch, Alvia tells us she's torn between respecting her mom's position at the school and feeling like the adults are protecting Owens instead of the students who are actually being harmed by all this. Zoe sits alone at a corner table in the cafeteria because some students have been teasing her about the stuffed elephant, making baby noises when she walks by in the hallways. Our group immediately picks up our trays and moves to sit with her at her table. Arthur announces loudly enough for nearby tables to hear that his little sister still sleeps with a security blanket, and there's nothing wrong with comfort objects that help people feel safe. Zoe smiles a little bit and thanks us for sitting with her, and we spend the rest of lunch period talking about normal stuff like homework and weekend plans, deliberately making it clear that we're not going to let people isolate any of us. After school that day, Eli had his regular meeting with his probation officer downtown. He sat in the small office waiting room flipping through a magazine, not really reading it. When his name got called, he went in and sat across from Mr. Nichols like he did every 2 weeks. They went through the usual questions about school attendance and grades and staying out of trouble. Then Eli asked something he'd been thinking about since Miss Owens mentioned his shoplifting incident in class. He wanted to know who could access his expunged record. Mr. Nichols looked confused and explained that expunged meant sealed, completely gone from public view. Even police needed a court order to see it. The only people with access were the judge who ordered the expungement, the probation office, and Eli himself. No teachers, no researchers, nobody else. Eli felt his stomach drop. If Mrs. Owens didn't get the information from official records, where did she get it? He texted our group chat immediately after leaving the office. The message said she couldn't have accessed legal documents, which meant she got the information some other way, probably through surveillance or talking to people who knew about it. That opened up a whole new set of concerns about how deeply she'd been digging into all our lives. Meanwhile, Arthur spent his evening at home working on something he'd been planning since our library meeting. He opened his laptop and started composing an email to Vice Principal Howard. He attached the timeline document we'd all been building in the shared file, showing 15 separate incidents of Ms. Owens revealing personal information about students over the past 4 days. Each entry had the date, time, exact quote, and names of witnesses. Arthur wrote that we were requesting a formal meeting to discuss the situation, and asked if student representatives could meet with administration. He hit send around 7 p.m. and didn't expect a response until the next day. But Howard replied within an hour. The email said she was taking our concerns seriously and wanted to meet with student representatives the following afternoon. She asked Arthur to bring any additional documentation we'd gathered and said up to 5 students could attend. Arthur forwarded the email to our group chat, and we quickly decided that he, Alvia, Eli, and I would go, with Harold as the 5th person. The next morning before first period, I went to the student records office on the 2nd floor. The clerk behind the counter looked bored until I explained what I needed. I filed a formal request to see my own educational file. I specifically asked if there had been any unusual access requests, or if my records had been shared with researchers or outside parties. The clerk seemed surprised by how specific my questions were. She printed out a form for me to sign and said I'd get a response within 5 business days per district policy. I thanked her and left, hoping the paper trail would show if Miss Owens had been accessing official school records. That same morning, all 15 of us met with Amira Whitaker in the counseling center before classes started. We crowded into her office, some sitting on chairs and others on the floor. Amira had cleared her schedule for a group session. She started by teaching us about trauma responses and how people react when someone tries to manipulate or control them. She explained that Miss Owens was using our private information as a power tool, trying to keep us off balance and scared. Then she gave us scripts for responding to personal questions. Simple phrases like, "I'm not discussing that," and "That's not appropriate for class." We practiced saying them out loud, taking turns until the words felt natural in our mouths. Amira made us repeat them over and over, getting louder and more confident each time. By the end of the session, even quiet students like Sarah could say the phrases firmly without their voices shaking. In second period, Miss Owens assigned a class discussion on privacy versus truth in relationships. She wrote questions on the board about whether people have a right to keep secrets that affect their community. She never mentioned any of us by name, but the manipulation was obvious. She kept steering the conversation toward situations where revealing secrets might be justified for the greater good. When she called on me to share my thoughts, I used one of Amira's scripts and said I preferred to keep the discussion focused on Romeo and Juliet. Mrs. Owens tried to push, suggesting my perspective would be valuable given recent events. I repeated that it wasn't appropriate for class discussion. Several other students did the same thing when she tried similar tactics with them. Her smile got tighter each time, but she had to move on. During lunch, I was sitting with our group in the cafeteria when I felt my chest getting tight. My breathing became shallow and quick. I recognized it as the start of a panic attack, something that had happened a few times before but not in months. I remembered the grounding technique Amira taught us that morning. I forced myself to focus on 5 things I could see: the lunch tray, Arthur's backpack, the clock on the wall, Alvia's notebook, the exit sign. Then 4 things I could touch: the table surface, my jeans, my phone in my pocket, the chair under me. 3 things I could hear: people talking at nearby tables, someone laughing, the scrape of chairs on the floor. My breathing slowly returned to normal. The tightness in my chest eased. I managed to stay in the cafeteria without having to run to the bathroom, which felt like a small victory. That afternoon, Harold decided to try something he'd seen in detective shows. He went to the public library and used their computers to access the city's traffic camera database. The system was supposed to be public record for anyone to request footage. He spent 3 hours trying to track Mrs. Owens's movements, hoping to document her surveillance patterns. He entered dates and times and locations, trying to find her car in the footage. But after all that work, he had to admit defeat. Most residential areas didn't have cameras, and the ones that existed didn't store footage for more than a week. The cameras only covered major intersections downtown. Harold texted us that real investigation had serious limits, unlike what TV shows made it look like. While Harold was at the library, Alvia used her mom's employee directory access at home. Her mom was at a school board meeting, so Alvia logged into the staff portal using the saved password on their home computer. She started tracing how Ms. Owens was hired, following the digital paper trail through the district's hiring system. What she found made her take screenshots immediately. Missy Owens came through a private substitute placement service rather than the normal district pool. The placement service had an exception process for specialized educational consultants that bypassed standard background checks. Mrs. Owens somehow qualified under that exception, which explained why her file was so empty. Alvia sent the screenshots to our group chat with a message saying this was probably how Ms. Owens got into our school without the normal vetting process. That evening, Arthur worked on another project at his desk. He created a digital map of Miss Owens's online presence, or rather her complete lack of one. He searched every social media platform: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok. No profiles under that name. He checked professional networking sites and college alumni listings. Nothing came up. He even tried searching for the teaching certificate number from her personnel file, but it led to a database error message. The number didn't exist in the state certification system. Arthur made a visual chart showing everywhere he'd searched and everywhere she didn't exist. It looked like someone had deliberately erased her digital footprint, scrubbing her presence from the internet. He saved the chart to our shared folder so we could show it at tomorrow's meeting with Howard. The next morning in class, Eli became the first person to really test our new boundary-setting approach. Miss Owens started a lesson about redemption and second chances in Romeo and Juliet. Then she turned to Eli and asked if he'd like to share his personal experience with redemption and how he'd grown from past mistakes. The classroom went silent. Everyone knew she was talking about his shoplifting incident. Eli looked right at her and said calmly that he wasn't comfortable being discussed in class. Mrs. Owens smiled and pushed, saying his story could inspire other students. Eli repeated the script exactly like we'd practiced. That's not appropriate. She tried one more time, suggesting he was being selfish by not sharing his journey. Eli said it again, his voice steady. That's not appropriate for class discussion. Miss Owens finally moved on to another student, and we all felt slightly less powerless watching Eli hold his ground without backing down. That afternoon, Zoe went home and sat at her computer with a plan. She created a new email account using a fake name and typed out a message to the education reporter at our local newspaper. She kept it simple, explaining that a substitute teacher at our high school had been watching students for years and knew personal information she shouldn't have access to. She wrote that the teacher seemed to be doing some kind of research project without anyone's permission, and that students felt unsafe. Within 2 hours, the reporter wrote back asking for more details and any papers or records we could share, but Zoe decided to hold off on sending anything else until after we met with Howard. She forwarded the reporter's response to our group chat, so we'd all know the media option was there if we needed it later. While Zoe was handling the newspaper contact, Arthur spent his evening searching for legal help. He found a civil liberties group that worked on education rights cases and called their hotline number. The person who answered listened to his quick explanation about a teacher conducting secret research on minors and transferred him to someone who knew more about student privacy laws. After about 15 minutes on the phone, they told Arthur we should talk to an attorney named Natasha Greco, who handled cases like ours. Arthur got her contact information and sent her an email that night explaining our situation. She responded the next morning saying she'd meet with us for free to review what we had and that we should bring all our papers, the hospital consent forms, and the timeline we'd been keeping. 3 days later, 6 of us took the bus downtown to Natasha's office after school. Her office was small and kind of messy with file boxes stacked against one wall and papers covering most of her desk. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her early 30s, wearing jeans and a blazer. We spread out all our evidence on the table in her conference room, and she spent almost an hour reading through everything we'd documented. She asked questions about specific incidents and took notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finished reviewing, she explained that we could file complaints under something called FERPA, which is a law about education records and who can access them. She also said we could use the school district's harassment process to report what Ms. Owens had been doing. Natasha printed out template letters for us and went through them line by line, showing us exactly what words to use to make our complaints sound official and legal instead of just emotional. She circled phrases like unauthorized disclosure of private information and violation of student privacy rights, and told us to use that kind of language because it would be taken more seriously by administrators and lawyers. That night, I sat at my desk staring at the blank complaint form, trying to decide what to write about July 25th. I knew I had to mention it because Miss Owens had threatened to expose it in front of the whole class, but I didn't want to actually say what happened. I went through about 5 different versions, crossing out words and rewriting sentences. Finally, I settled on something that felt safe enough. I wrote that Miss Owens had talked about a private personal matter from July 25th in front of the class, and that she could only know about it through watching me without permission or getting into private records she wasn't supposed to see. It felt like I was protecting myself while still being honest about what she'd done. I printed it out and put it in a folder with all the other papers we were bringing to Howard. The next morning, Arthur, Alvia, Eli, and I met outside the main office before first period. We checked in at the front desk, and the secretary told us Howard was ready. Her office had windows looking out at the parking lot and a big wooden desk covered with neat stacks of papers. Howard was probably in her 50s with short gray hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. We handed her our timeline and all the documentation we'd gathered, including the screenshots of Miss Owens's fake personnel file and the hospital consent forms our families had signed. She read through everything carefully, stopping sometimes to make notes or ask us to clarify when something happened. Her face got more and more concerned as she kept reading. When she finished, she told us she was starting an internal inquiry right away, and that she'd arrange for another administrator to sit in Ms. Owens's classes and observe what was happening. She said it wasn't everything we wanted, but it was a start, and it was the first time an adult with real authority had actually listened to us and believed something was seriously wrong. Later that day, I checked my email and found a message from Reed Stiles at the hospital. He wrote that he'd gotten my written complaint and that it had been sent to the Institutional Review Board for them to look into. But then he spent a whole paragraph defending the consent form language, saying it was legally adequate, and that families had agreed to participate in research when they signed the admission papers. Reading that made me so angry I had to close my laptop and walk away for a few minutes. Just because something is legal doesn't make it right, and he was hiding behind technical language instead of admitting that what happened was wrong. The hospital had taken advantage of families when they were scared and vulnerable, and now they were acting like that was perfectly fine because the paperwork said they could. That evening at dinner, my mom asked me why I'd been digging through old family papers and asking questions about Aunt Marie's time in the hospital. I could tell she was annoyed that I was bringing up painful memories. I took a deep breath and told her the whole truth about Miss Owens, the research project, how she'd been watching all of us for years through our connections to the hospital. My mom's first reaction was to get defensive, saying I was dredging up the past and that Marie's hospitalization was private family business. But as I kept explaining and showed her the consent forms with the research clauses buried in the legal language, her expression changed. She read through the forms slowly, her finger tracing the lines of text. Finally, she admitted that she'd never fully understood what Marie was signing back then, that they'd all just trusted the hospital staff and signed whatever forms they put in front of them because they were focused on getting Marie help. My phone buzzed with a text from Arthur to the group chat. He wrote that his family had a meeting that afternoon where they decided to stop hiding his grandmother's illness and talk about it openly with their relatives. He said he felt relieved that the secret was finally out, but also angry that Mrs. Owens had forced the timing instead of letting his family handle it their own way. His message really captured how complicated everything felt for all of us. This weird mix of relief that our private lives were becoming less private, but also fury that we hadn't gotten to choose when or how to share our own information. The next evening, Alvia texted that she'd had a hard conversation with her mom about their family's separation becoming public knowledge at the school. They'd decided together that they'd rather control their own story than let rumors and gossip spread. Alvia's mom had apologized for brushing off her concerns at first, and promised to support the complaint process even though it was awkward since she worked at the school. Alvia seemed lighter after that conversation, like having her mom actually on her side made everything feel more manageable. Later that same night, Harold's brother called him. Harold put the call on speaker, so we could all hear since we were hanging out at his house working on homework. His brother said he felt terrible about signing such broad consent forms during his mental health crisis, that he should have read them more carefully or asked more questions. Harold told him firmly that he'd been vulnerable and scared, and that the hospital had taken advantage of that vulnerability. He said the fault was with the institutions that were supposed to protect patients, but instead treated them like research subjects. After the call ended, Harold seemed calmer than he'd been in days, like talking it through with his brother had helped him figure out where to direct his anger, instead of letting it eat at him from the inside. The next afternoon, we all gathered in the library's back study room where nobody could overhear us. Arthur spread out his laptop and opened a new document while the rest of us pulled chairs into a tight circle around the table. We needed a plan for handling Miss Owens in class, something that would protect us without giving her more material to use against us. Alvia suggested we create a standard response that we could all use when she tried to probe into personal stuff, and everyone agreed that was smart. Harold typed out different options while we debated the exact wording, trying to find something that sounded polite enough to avoid getting in trouble, but firm enough to shut down her questions. After 20 minutes of discussion, we settled on a simple phrase that felt right. Arthur read it aloud to make sure everyone could remember it easily. We practiced saying it out loud, taking turns until it felt natural coming out of our mouths. The script was just one sentence, but we all agreed that if Miss Owens kept pushing after we used it, we'd document exactly what she said and leave the classroom as a group. Zoe pulled out her phone and we all saved the phrase in our notes apps, so we wouldn't forget it under pressure. Before we left the library, we made a pact to stick together no matter what happened, and everyone put their hands in the center of the table, like we were a team heading into battle. The next morning, I walked into class with my stomach in knots, knowing Miss Owens would try something. She was already at the front of the room writing on the whiteboard when we filed in, and I noticed Vice Principal Howard sitting in the back corner with a notepad. Missy Owens turned around and smiled at us like nothing was wrong, then announced we'd be writing an essay about secrets that define us. She explained that we needed to dig deep into our personal experiences and share something meaningful that shaped who we are today. My hands started shaking as I gripped my pen, and I saw Arthur's jaw clench across the room. One by one, we each said the same thing we'd practiced in the library. Missy Owens's smile tightened after the third person refused, and by the time all 15 of us had used the exact same phrase, her face looked like stone. She walked to her desk and pulled out her gradebook, making a big show of marking zeros next to each of our names. Howard was writing quickly in his notepad, his pen moving fast across the page. Miss Owens announced that anyone who didn't complete the assignment would fail this portion of the semester grade, but none of us changed our minds. The rest of the class sat in uncomfortable silence, watching this standoff happen right in front of them. When the bell rang, Howard stood up and asked Miss Owens to come to his office, and we all exchanged relieved looks as we packed up our stuff. That afternoon, rumors spread through school that Mrs. Owens was in trouble. Howard had called an emergency meeting with her right after our class, and apparently it lasted over an hour. By the time we got to our next period, word had gotten around that something serious was happening. After school, Arthur got an email from Howard explaining that effective immediately, Mrs. Owens was banned from making any personal references to students or requiring personal disclosures in assignments while the inquiry continued. The email said she'd agreed to these terms and would focus solely on teaching the assigned curriculum. We all knew this was a win, but nobody felt like celebrating. Miss Owens was smart enough to find ways around these rules, and we'd just have to stay alert. That night, I lay in bed thinking about how she'd probably just get more sneaky instead of backing off completely, and I was right. 2 days later in class, Miss Owens gave a lecture that made my skin crawl even though she never mentioned any of us by name. She talked about ethics in research and how sometimes people who participate in studies don't realize they're helping create knowledge until years later. She used phrases like co-authors of social truth and kept saying that observation was a form of collaboration, whether the subjects recognized it or not. Her whole lecture was basically justifying what she'd been doing to us, wrapping her surveillance in academic language that made it sound legitimate. I could see several students shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and Sarah finally raised her hand. She pointed out that collaboration usually means everyone agrees to participate, and we never agreed to be part of any research study. Mrs. Owens smiled and said that consent is complicated, especially when the research is observational rather than experimental. The way she twisted everything to make herself sound reasonable made me want to scream, but I forced myself to stay quiet and just write down everything she said for our documentation. Later that week, Natasha sent formal cease and desist letters to both the school district and the hospital's legal department. Arthur showed us a copy during lunch, and it was full of legal language about federal regulations on research with minors. Natasha argued that the consent forms our parents signed didn't meet the legal standards for ongoing surveillance of children, and she demanded that all research involving our families be stopped immediately. She cited specific regulations and included footnotes with case law, making it clear she knew exactly what she was talking about. The letter to the school district was slightly different, focusing on educational privacy laws and the district's responsibility to protect students from unauthorized research. Reading those letters made me feel like we finally had someone with real power on our side, someone who could speak the language these institutions understood. A few days after the letters went out, Reed from the hospital scheduled a call with Natasha. She put it on speaker so Arthur and I could listen in from her office, though we had to stay completely quiet. Reed sounded defensive at first, saying the admission forms were technically valid because parents had signed them. But Natasha pushed back hard, walking him through the specific requirements for informed consent when research involves minors. She pointed out that the forms were buried in admission paperwork during family crises, and that nobody had explained the research component clearly. Reed was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke again, his tone had changed. He admitted that while the forms were signed by parents, they probably didn't constitute valid informed consent for classroom-based research on children. He agreed to pause any data collection until the Institutional Review Board could review the whole protocol. Natasha thanked him professionally and ended the call, then turned to us with a small smile. It wasn't a complete victory since Reed was clearly just protecting the hospital from liability, but it meant Miss Owens couldn't legally keep gathering data on us. The next day at lunch, I pulled Arthur aside to a quiet corner of the cafeteria. My heart was pounding as I tried to figure out how to start, but Arthur just waited patiently like he always did. I told him the truth about July 25th, explaining exactly what happened and why I was so scared of Mrs. Owens revealing it publicly. Arthur listened without interrupting, his face serious but not judgmental. When I finished talking, he was quiet for a minute, then said he understood why I'd been so panicked. We agreed that he'd keep it completely private unless I decided to tell people myself, and just having one person know the truth made me feel less alone. Arthur squeezed my shoulder and said that whatever happened, I didn't have to face it by myself anymore. That evening, our whole group got on a video call to talk about next steps. Zoe brought up her idea about going to the media again, saying that public pressure might force faster action than the official complaint process. We spent almost an hour debating the pros and cons, with some people wanting to expose everything, and others worried about losing control of our own stories. Eventually, we took a vote and decided to focus on getting policy changes through official channels first. Public exposure might feel good in the moment, but it could also backfire and make us look like we were just seeking attention. We wanted to be strategic and smart about this, not just reactive and emotional. The next morning, news spread through school that the teacher union rep had contacted the district about substitute oversight. Apparently, she'd heard about our complaints through the grapevine and was concerned about the lack of proper screening for substitute teachers. The district responded by officially pausing Mrs. Owens' assignment while they completed their internal inquiry. That meant she wouldn't be teaching our class starting next week, which felt like the biggest win we'd had so far. Everyone was texting in the group chat, sharing the news and expressing relief that we wouldn't have to face her every day anymore. On what turned out to be Miss Owens' last day, she was already packing up her materials when we walked into class. Students filed in talking and laughing, not realizing what was happening. I took my seat and pulled out my notebook, trying to act normal even though my hands were shaking. Miss Owens walked past my desk carrying a box of her stuff, and she leaned down close enough that only I could hear. She said she'd be continuing her observations from a distance, and the way she phrased it was careful. Not quite a threat, but close enough. The message was clear that she considered her research ongoing whether the district approved or not. I forced myself to look her in the eyes and not react, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing how much her words shook me. She smiled that horrible, pleasant smile and walked out of the classroom, and I sat there trying to steady my breathing while everyone around me celebrated that she was finally gone. I spent the next few days in a weird kind of limbo where Ms. Owens was gone, but the damage she'd done was still everywhere. Amira scheduled a group session for all 15 of us in the counseling center conference room, and we showed up looking tired and anxious. She had us sit in a circle and asked how we were feeling now that Miss Owens wasn't teaching our class anymore. The answers came slowly at first, with people admitting they still felt watched, still jumped when someone said their name, still had trouble sleeping. Zoe said she kept checking her room for cameras even though she knew that was probably paranoid. Harold mentioned he'd started leaving his phone in another room at night because he couldn't stop thinking about being tracked. Amira listened to all of it without judgment, and then taught us some grounding techniques for when the anxiety got bad. She helped us set up a private group chat where we could check in with each other, just a quick message to say we were okay, or to ask if anyone else was feeling weird about something. By the end of the session, I felt a little less alone, like maybe we could actually support each other through this instead of each of us suffering separately. Amira gave us printed sheets with coping strategies and her personal cell number in case any of us needed to talk outside school hours, which felt like more support than I'd expected from an adult at the school. 3 days later, my mom came home from work with an official letter from the district office. She sat down at the kitchen table and read it twice before calling me over. The letter notified our family that Miss Owens' substitute placement had been terminated effective immediately, and that a rotation of regular substitute teachers would cover our class until a permanent replacement was found. The wording was careful, talking about administrative decisions and staffing adjustments without actually admitting the district had done anything wrong. My mom looked at me over the top of the letter and said she could read between the lines, that she knew something serious had happened even if the district wouldn't say it directly. She told me she was proud I'd stood up for myself and my friends, that it took courage to challenge a teacher and push back against authority. I felt something loosen in my chest hearing her say that, like maybe I hadn't been crazy or dramatic for making such a big deal about Ms. Owens. We talked for almost an hour about what had happened, and my mom admitted she felt guilty for not reading those hospital consent forms more carefully 5 years ago when my aunt was admitted. She said she'd trusted the hospital staff to explain what she was signing and never imagined they'd use that paperwork to study our family without our knowledge. 2 weeks passed, and I was starting to think we wouldn't hear anything else when an envelope arrived from the hospital's institutional review board. I opened it with shaking hands and found a formal letter acknowledging they were reviewing the research protocol Ms. Owens had been operating under. The letter was full of official language about ethical standards and oversight procedures, and it didn't promise any specific punishments or consequences. But it did confirm that all data collection involving our families had been paused pending the review, and that felt like more accountability than I'd expected. I took a photo of the letter and posted it in our group chat, and within minutes everyone was responding with relief and cautious hope. Arthur pointed out that paused wasn't the same as ended, that Mrs. Owens could theoretically resume her research if the review board decided she hadn't violated any rules. But even that possibility felt less scary now that we knew someone official was actually looking at what she'd done. The next week, Amira pulled Zoe and 3 other students out of study hall for what she called a restorative conversation. Zoe had told Amira about the teasing she'd been getting since Ms. Owens revealed her stuffed elephant secret, and Amira wanted to address it directly, instead of just telling Zoe to ignore the bullies. The conversation was awkward, according to Zoe, with the other students initially defensive about their jokes. But Amira made them talk about how it felt to have their own secrets exposed by Miss Owens, and eventually they admitted they'd been taking out their own anxiety by making fun of someone else. They apologized to Zoe, and the teasing stopped after that. Zoe told our group later that having an adult actually do something about the bullying instead of brushing it off made her feel like student concerns actually mattered at our school. It was a small thing compared to everything else that had happened, but it meant something that the administration was taking our emotional safety seriously for once. Arthur and I met at a coffee shop near school to talk about how we were going to handle future classes. We both felt jumpy about assignments that might touch on secrets or privacy, worried that some random teacher would accidentally trigger all the anxiety Miss Owens had created. We spent 2 hours making a plan for how to communicate with teachers up front about topics that were difficult for us. Arthur suggested we could email teachers at the start of each semester explaining we'd had a bad experience with a previous instructor and asking them to give us a heads up about potentially sensitive assignments. I added that we should probably have a code word we could text each other when something in class felt overwhelming. Just a quick way to check in without making a scene. We agreed to meet for coffee every few weeks just to talk through how we were doing, because it helped to have someone who understood exactly what we'd been through. By the time we left the coffee shop, I felt more prepared to face whatever came next, like we'd built ourselves a safety net. I'd been avoiding Amira's suggestion about seeing a therapist outside school for weeks, but I finally accepted the referral card she'd given me. I called the number and scheduled my first appointment for the following Thursday. The receptionist asked what I wanted to work on, and I said anxiety and trust issues, which felt like a massive understatement, but I wasn't ready to explain the whole Mrs. Owens situation over the phone. Hanging up after making the appointment, I felt nervous about talking to another stranger about July 25th, about opening up that particular wound to someone new. But I was also tired of carrying the weight of it alone, tired of jumping every time someone said my name or mentioned Summer. I knew I needed help processing everything that had happened, not just with Miss Owens, but with the thing she'd almost exposed. The appointment was still 6 days away, but just having it scheduled made me feel like I was taking control of my own healing, instead of waiting for someone else to fix things. 3 weeks after Miss Owens left, the school hosted a community meeting about consent and privacy in educational research. I didn't expect many people to show up, but about 30 parents and students filled the library meeting room. The principal opened by acknowledging there had been concerns about a recent substitute teacher, still not naming Ms. Owens directly or admitting fault. But then they opened the floor for discussion, and the conversation got surprisingly honest. Parents admitted they didn't always read forms carefully, that they trusted schools and hospitals to look out for their kids' interests. Students talked about feeling like their privacy didn't matter to institutions, like we were just data points or case studies instead of actual people. One mom stood up and said she'd signed consent forms when her daughter was hospitalized 2 years ago, and never imagined those forms would allow someone to watch her family for years afterward. A dad asked what the school was doing to prevent this from happening again, and the principal promised they were reviewing all substitute screening procedures. It wasn't a perfect meeting, and some people left frustrated that there weren't immediate answers, but at least the conversation was happening instead of being swept under the rug. Natasha met with our core group at her office to outline our options for civil litigation against the hospital or school district. She spread out papers showing different legal theories we could pursue, talking about privacy violations and emotional distress and unauthorized research on minors. Arthur asked how long a lawsuit would take, and Natasha said probably 2 to 3 years minimum, with no guarantee we'd win. She explained that litigation is expensive and emotionally draining, that we'd have to relive everything in depositions and possibly testify in court. We spent an hour debating whether we wanted to go that route or focus our energy on policy changes instead. Eli pointed out that suing might feel satisfying, but it wouldn't necessarily prevent future violations, while new policies could actually protect other students. Zoe said she wanted Miss Owens to face consequences, but wasn't sure she could handle years of legal battles. Eventually, we voted and decided we'd rather push for systemic changes than spend years in court fighting about the past. Natasha said she respected that choice and offered to help us draft recommendations for the school board, focusing on preventing future violations rather than punishing past ones. We left her office feeling good about the decision, like we were being strategic instead of just reactive. The next school board meeting was packed because word had spread about students speaking during public comment. 5 of us signed up, and we'd carefully coordinated what we'd say to avoid identifying details while still making the harm clear. Arthur went first and talked about how it felt to have family medical information exposed without consent. Alvia spoke about the violation of having private family matters discussed publicly. I talked about living with constant anxiety that someone was watching and documenting my life. Zoe described the bullying that resulted from having personal information revealed. Eli explained how it felt to have sealed juvenile records somehow accessed and referenced. Each of us spoke for 3 minutes, and the board members listened without interrupting. When we finished, the board chair thanked us for our courage and said our testimony made clear that current policies weren't adequate. They voted unanimously to direct the superintendent to draft updated privacy policies for review at next month's meeting. 2 board members came up to us afterward and personally thanked us for speaking up, saying they had teenagers at home and couldn't imagine what we'd been through. Walking out of that meeting, I felt something shift inside me, like maybe our voices actually mattered and could create change. That weekend, I sat down with my mom in the living room and told her I needed to talk about something serious. She put down her phone and gave me her full attention, and I took a deep breath before starting. I told her the full truth about July 25th, the thing I'd been terrified Ms. Owens would expose in front of everyone. The words came out shaky at first, but then faster as I explained what had happened and why I'd kept it secret for months. My mom was quiet for a long time after I finished, just sitting there looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Finally, she said she wished I'd felt safe enough to tell her sooner, that she hated thinking I'd been carrying that weight alone all this time. The conversation was painful, and there were tears from both of us, but it didn't end in catastrophe the way I'd feared. She didn't yell or punish me or tell me I'd ruined everything. She just held my hand and said we'd figure it out together, that whatever consequences came from the truth would be better than living with the secret. Later that night, I wrote in my journal at my new time and realized that Mrs. Owens had tried to weaponize my secret, but instead I'd chosen to share it on my own terms, and that made all the difference. A few days later, I opened my email before school and saw a message from Reed at the hospital compliance office with the subject line, Policy Updates, regarding research participation. The email was formal and businesslike, explaining that the hospital was revising all admission forms to include much clearer language about research participation, with separate sections that families would have to check and sign if they wanted to opt in. Reed didn't apologize for what had happened to us, but he did write that the new forms would make it impossible for families to unknowingly enroll in studies the way ours had been. I forwarded the email to our group chat, and Arthur responded that it wasn't enough, but it was something, and at least future families wouldn't be trapped the way we were. The policy change felt small compared to what we'd been through, but I knew it mattered because it meant Mrs. Owens couldn't do this to anyone else. That same morning, the district sent an email to all staff announcing that Mrs. Owens had formally withdrawn from her substitute assignment, citing philosophical differences about educational approaches. The email was brief and didn't mention any of what had actually happened, which frustrated me because it made it sound like a normal resignation instead of what it really was. 2 hours later, I got a separate notification from the Institutional Review Board saying that Mrs. Owens' research protocol was under formal review for ethical violations. The IRB letter was full of legal language about procedures and timelines, and while it didn't promise any specific consequences, at least the process was happening, and someone with authority was examining what she'd done. I showed both emails to Arthur at lunch, and he said it felt weird to have things wrapping up through official channels when we'd spent weeks feeling like nobody believed us. The next week, Arthur filed a formal request through the district asking for any data or notes that Ms. Owens had kept about students during her assignment. He used the template that Natasha had given us, making sure to include all the right legal language about student records and privacy rights. The district response came back 3 days later saying that nothing was found on district devices, email systems, or cloud storage. Arthur was angry when he showed us the letter because we all knew Miss Owens had been taking notes and keeping files, but she'd been smart enough to keep everything on personal devices we couldn't access. Harold said we should try to get a court order to force her to turn over her personal files, but Natasha explained that would require proof she had them and a specific legal violation, which we couldn't establish. I hated knowing that Miss Owens probably still had all her research somewhere, years of observations and notes about our lives, but I was learning that some things were beyond our control. Our group met at the library on Saturday to talk about how to move forward, and the conversation shifted from fighting Miss Owens to protecting ourselves. Harold suggested we all invest in encryption software for our devices and change our routines so we weren't predictable anymore. We spent 2 hours researching different security programs and privacy tools, comparing features and prices until we found options that would work. Arthur set up a secure messaging app for our group chat and showed everyone how to enable two-factor authentication on their accounts. Harold made a joke that we'd become amateur security experts, and while it was sad that we felt we needed these precautions, at least we were taking back some control over our information. I changed all my passwords that night and enabled encryption on my journal app, and even though it felt paranoid, it also felt like I was protecting myself in a way I hadn't before. The following Monday, Amira called a meeting with our core group and proposed that we form an official student privacy club with her as faculty advisor. She explained that the club could educate other students about their rights regarding personal information and advocate for stronger privacy protections in the school policies. We all agreed immediately because it felt like a way to turn our trauma into something constructive that could help other people. Amira helped us write a club charter and mission statement, and by the end of the week, we had approval from the Student Activities Office. We put up flyers around school inviting students to join, and at our first meeting, we had 23 people show up, including students from other grades who had their own concerns about privacy and data collection. Zoe volunteered to be president, and Eli agreed to handle outreach, and watching the club take shape made me feel like we were building something that would last beyond our own experience. 2 weeks after Ms. Owens left, the administration published interim guidelines for all teachers about student privacy and personal information. The guidelines stated that personal disclosures could not be required for grades, that class rosters must be used for attendance rather than personal knowledge, and that any concerns about student behavior must trigger specific observation protocols with parental notification. The guidelines weren't perfect, and we knew they could be stronger, but they were a concrete improvement that wouldn't have existed if we hadn't spoken up. Arthur made copies of the guidelines, and we posted them in the Privacy Club meeting space, and every time I saw them on the wall, I felt proud that we'd pushed for actual policy changes. One evening, about a month after everything started, I sat down at my desk and deliberately opened my journal at 9:30 p.m., instead of my old time of 10:47. Choosing a new time felt like a small act of rebellion, taking back a routine that Ms. Owens had documented and making it mine again on my own terms. As I wrote about everything that had happened over the past weeks, I realized that she had taken away my sense of privacy and safety, but I was slowly building it back through my own choices. The new journaling time became my routine, something I picked rather than a habit someone else had observed and cataloged. I wrote about the policy changes and the privacy club and the conversation with my mom, and it felt different knowing I'd chosen to share some things while keeping others private. The next morning, we had our first class period with a regular long-term substitute, a middle-aged teacher named Mrs. Nichols, who introduced herself using the roster and asked us to raise our hands when she called our names. She taught Romeo and Juliet by discussing the actual play, making connections to themes, and asking us to analyze Shakespeare's language without any personal commentary about our lives. Someone asked a question about the balcony scene, and Mrs. Nichols answered it with a reference to Elizabethan theater conventions, and then another student made a joke about the Old English language, and Mrs. Nichols laughed and several other people laughed too. The relief in the room was obvious, this feeling of normalcy washing over all of us as we realized that class could just be class again. I looked around and saw people taking notes and raising their hands and acting like regular students instead of research subjects, and I understood how tense we'd all been for weeks. That night, I wrote in my journal at my new time of 9:30, reflecting on everything that had happened since Ms. Owens walked into our classroom that first day. I wrote that I wasn't fixed or healed, that I still got anxious sometimes about being watched and worried about my privacy in ways I never had before. But I also wrote that I wasn't prey anymore, that we'd chosen what to share and what to keep private, that we'd built a community that supported each other through the worst of it. We'd changed policies that would protect future students and created a club that would keep advocating for privacy rights long after we graduated. Mrs. Owens had wanted to study how we'd react to having our secrets exposed and our privacy violated, but what she actually taught us was that we were stronger than we knew. Speaking up for yourself isn't just brave, it's necessary for healing and growth, and sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to be silent when someone tries to make you feel powerless. And we're done. Here's what I want to know. Was the hospital more guilty than the teacher? Drop your verdict below. Subscribe if you love our comment debates.